and then we'll count up. Happy Mardi Gras, by the way. You've been in New Orleans? You've been to New Orleans, I'm sure.
I have been to New Orleans, but never for Mardi Gras.
Yeah.
So I definitely would love to see that at some point in my life. I'm sure seems like you're a lifer, or at least will be there for a good long while. So
I hope so.
When we all get vaccinated and get back to seeing each other physically, I definitely something I'd love to do. That or Jazz Fest. I'd love to go down for Jazz Fest.
Yeah, that's true. Like our age, Jazz Fest is more our speed. Well, let's get up to speed. Let's go live. Welcome back. We're back. We turn the calendar forward, but there's always something good to think about and talk about. That's why we're back. And I'm really happy to get to spend time with Jason Wood. And we're going to talk coaching changes. Now that all the coaching changes are in, you've been covering this area for us for a long time, Woodrow. Before we jump into any specific one, I want to, Jason I think of your judgment, Jason, like a samurai sword, like sharp, you're focused in, and you're always agnostic about coaching changes for the most part. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you always make sure to emphasize in any conversation we have, like, well, let's remember how wildly varying the outcomes are from our armchair prognostications when all these coaching hires go down. So did I capture that? And tell the folks what's really beneath that.
Yeah, well, first of all, comparing me to anything Kurosawa related, it warms my heart. So you're my man for that. In anticipation of our chat, I actually pulled up a little data kind of behind that. But what you're getting at is something I always tell our staff, which is that it's like perfectly natural because we're all analytical and it's relatively a quiet period, the hiring cycle, other than the playoffs. And so it's totally rational for us to get really excited about all the changes and extrapolate what we think is going to happen and what hires make sense to us, which ones don't. And I think there's a validity to the process. So I don't want to say it's not worth doing or why are we doing the show. But I think what you're getting at,
we're doing a show to say we really shouldn't do the show.
No, but what I think you're getting at, and it's really important, is that in spite of what we're going to talk about for the next hour or so, and what you and Cease talked about last week, and what everybody's writing articles about, we just have to be mindful that, as with any prognostication, we're likely to be very wrong. And coaching, of all of the things that we forecast in football, I would posit that it's harder to get the coaching hires right at the point of the hire than even things like forecasting rookies and how they're going to play or veteran free agent moves. And the reason for that is very simple. The data and factors that we use to make our snap judgments are, by most accounts, very uncorrelated to the outcome of the hire. And the factors that we would ideally like to be provided and the data we could make better use of is either very difficult to track down or we just don't have access to it, And part of that is that quite often, I gave you a little nudge on this last week. We often judge head coaching hires in particular by how well they fared as a coordinator, statistically. And that is just a woefully ineffective way of measuring success. And I want to thank Mike Vrabel, because he's forever going to be my postulate on this. I call it the Vrabel postulate. If you were to ask most NFL fans about Mike Vrabel, hardcore fans, they would say, oh, hard-nosed, tough player for the Patriots, tough guy, ended up going and being a defensive coach with the Texans and then transitioned beautifully into a head coach with the Titans. Now, that is all true. But what people may not remember is that Mike Vrabel, when he was hired in 2018, he was one of 7 head coaching hires that year. He was labeled the worst hire by CBS, NFL.com, and ESPN. Now, why was that? Well, because Mike Vrabel, when he was hired to coach the Titans, had spent 1 year as an NFL defensive coordinator for the Texans. And in that 1 year, the Texans defense ranked 32nd out of 32 teams. It was the worst defense by far and away in the league. And the year before, the Texans defense was 11th. And the year after, when Romeo Crennel came back and took the job again, they were 4th. Mm-hmm. So, if we were just basing Vrabel's bona fides on what he did as a coordinator, he was both incredibly inexperienced and in his one stint, woefully ineffective. Yet, when we fast forward to 2021, Vrabel, I would argue, is the best hire of that 7, at least up there, right? John Gruden was the was the consensus top hire. Gruden actually is the only one of the coaches that still have their job of that class that has a losing record. He's 19-29, pretty terrible, right? But as we know, the Raiders gave him a 10-year deal, so he's going to stick around. Matt Patricia was the believe it or not, the number 2 consensus pick for best hire. We all know how that ended. He was 13-29-1. Frank Reich was the 3rd and is 28-20, so that was a good call. Steve Wilkes was 4th among the 7. He was one and done. Matt Nagy was 5th, and he's now listen. Matt Nagy's had 2 8-8 seasons and is probably on the hot seat this year. But he's 28-20 and had some playoff success. And then Pat Shurmur was 6th, which again he's fired and that was a bad hire. But like my point is, Vrabel was below all of those guys, and yet he's clearly had the most success of the bunch, right? So it's just very difficult, because the factors that make a good head coach are things we can't measure, right? Things like ability to communicate, ability to recruit a staff, ability to assess talent, ability to find common ground with your player personnel executives. And that could mean either you realize that you're comfortable with not having any say in the ingredients, or if you want to say that you and your player personnel are on the same page in the kinds of players you want in the locker room, right? All these things we just don't know unless the hire's a retread, unless it's someone that's been a head coach before and we can at least get some sense of how that went. So it's tricky.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I think that you put front and center at the end what's the most important takeaway, which is success as an offensive or defensive coordinator is not an indicator of success as a head coach. And someone should just do the numbers. Analytics, right? Everyone loves analytics numbers. Like someone can probably put together some sort of study to show that, ranking of their offense and defense before they became head coach is no correlation, or maybe even like negative correlation. The point is there's no just noise. If you try to look for that, there are things we could look for. There are things the people doing the hiring are looking for, right? Like the human element, really. I don't know how else to describe it. Like a feeling they give you inside when you think of like giving them the keys.
Sure.
So now we can still talk about like fantasy football effects and systems and things like that. Mm-hmm. So there's always, or just in general, like understanding better what the team is going to look like going forward, or at this point starting to speculate about the directions, which is fascinating. And also another thing, I thought the stat was like 17 of the last 24 Super Bowl winners or something like that. Don't quote me. The coaches were on their 2nd or 3rd job that won the Super Bowl. So there's like the second chance, like Belichick, like your second time around, you've learned something. Or you mentioned Vrabel, like, what about John Harbaugh, like a special teams coach, if it's supposed to be based on your magic system. And I think a lot of the failed head coaches that are better coordinators are the ones that think they're hired to put in their magic system and try to really focus on that and force everything into a box instead of, I got to give credit to say like Sean McVay for evolving in his sense as a coach king. And that's why people keep hiring coaches off his staff,
Yeah, I mean, McVay's a great example of one that the consensus got right. He was the top rated hire in 2017, so the year before that group we just talked about. And I've heard people argue back at me with relative to this discussion, like, well, everybody loved McVay and he didn't have a lot of experience. And I'm like, well, again, that's revisionist history. Like Sean McVay was the youngest head coach in NFL history when he was hired. That's true, but he had 3 years of calling NFL offenses in Washington. So he was not inexperienced at all. And again, we now know, because he's been successful and we know more about him, Sean McVay is literally a 1 in a million person. He has a photographic memory. He remembers, I mean, literally, I think you know this, but he remembers every play he's ever called. He's one of those rare, beautiful minds that is, if the NFL could find 32 people who love the NFL and had photographic memories, I would argue they should hire those 32 people to run the offense, right? I mean, so he was an experienced guy, young but not inexperienced.
Yeah, and I love that you touched on organizational clarity. I think McVay obviously is a good example of someone who probably institutes this, but just reminds me. I think it was one of the writers from Shane Williams from Pro Football Talk. brought up something like yesterday about sometimes even within an organization, like organizations don't just have different draft boards from each other, but within an organization, a scout might have a different board from another scout. And that kind of surprised me a little bit because I would think you would have agreements on some of those things, like how we win, like what you look, you said what you look for in the locker room or from, from a personal character standpoint. And there's also just like what they look for in the field, and there'd be agreed upon definitions, but that's draft season. That's an entire conversation.
Can't wait for that too, by the way.
Yeah. Well, the quarterbacks, right? I mean, we have good quarterbacks to churn the storyline, and that makes everything else fall into place. Before we jump into individual talk about teams, the overall consensus is it was disappointing head coaching cycle hiring in terms of minority hiring, much more encouraging from a GM standpoint. There's a big tangle of things to talk about here, Woodrow, and jump in wherever you want.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you. In fact, I would probably be more dramatic about it. I'd say it was a step back in the wrong direction from my vantage. I don't, I think that you look at the 7 hires and you've got two. You've got 2 people of color, right? And if you're going to handicap while we can't necessarily, as we've been talking about, forecast how each of these coaches is going to succeed, we can, I think, very effectively talk about the attractiveness and organizational structure that they're stepping into. And David Culley, who is the only African American coach hired this year, was. I think it's hard to make a case he didn't step into the situation that was least enviable. Right. So you almost get to worry, like,
and it gets less enviable every day.
Precisely. And now Robert Saleh, who, is Muslim, and I admittedly don't know his ethnicity by descent, but certainly he would count as a person of color if we're going to talk about diversity. He was a very sought after hire, and I think probably would have had multiple offers on the table to end up taking the Jets job. So that's great to see. But yeah, I mean, 2 out of 7. We have less minority head coaches in the NFL now than we did 5 years ago. You did mention that at sort of at the tail end of the hiring cycle, we did get some much needed underrepresented infusion at the GM and player personnel level, which is good to see. So that is good. But even that, I mean, we're still talking about only a handful of NFL executives are people of color. So I think it's still very problematic. I know. I just don't think it's something we should sugarcoat. I think it's a problem. It's a systemic problem that they talk a lot about fixing, but haven't fixed. Now, I know that you and Cease talked about Bieniemy specifically, and that's an interesting one to me because being an Andy Reid guy and an Eagles lifer and all that, I kind of feel like I always keep a close eye on all of Reid's coaching staff and their tree. I think Bieniemy suffers from a couple things. I think for him, he's just in a tough spot because, fair or unfair, most of the time, if you're a coach that is on a team that's going into the Super Bowl, you're going to have less doors open. Teams just get angsty. I suspect if one of these years, Bieniemy, maybe next year, if the Chiefs get ousted in the wild card round or the AFC, I think he'll get a job. I do. So I think that's coming. But overall, I think the lack of progress on minority coaching is disgraceful. It's something that we know the NFL could fix if they were more motivated to do so, or they should be able to, I should say.
Yeah. Every time I think about this, what I will say always, Jason, is the NFL doesn't do the Rooney Rule or the compensatory pick rule out of the goodness of their heart,
right? Because
they know there's a problem. I mean, and they're trying to address the problem. And we can talk about solutions, but we can also just talk about agreeing that there's a problem, and it's just a representation problem. And
yeah. And we're too quick to celebrate, like when a high, because there's the tokenization, right? Oh, it's great. Like, let's hear it for Robert Saleh. Let's hear it for David Culley. Yeah, absolutely. But again, let's not get lost in the anecdotes. Those are things worth celebrating, but it still needs to be looked at holistically. And for a league that spends tens of millions of dollars on analytics and next-gen stats, this is something they should be able to have their hands around and understand the problems. At best, it's not gotten better. At worst, it's getting worse, at least over the last 5 years.
Yeah, wow. I mean, and my brain was going in a number of directions. But I mean, at least you hear more people talking about cronyism and nepotism in the, not just obviously in the NFL, but in NFL hiring, which is a subset of what's going on. And you had the Tampa Bay Buccaneers win the Super Bowl with 3 black coordinators,
which is
so
great. And that's the kind of thing that will help, right? And again, this isn't going to be solved overnight. So that's the kind of thing that I think, it will and should help. And that's great to see.
nothing's going to be solved overnight. But where do you want to start? So we got 7 new head coaches. Where do you want to start?
Well, why don't we? I have an article coming out, hopefully tomorrow, but maybe this weekend. It's going to be the first of our coaching articles, but it's going to kind of look at the heat map relative to what I view as the most dramatic changes, right, organizationally. Like 10 being the whole thing got blown up and all new decision makers and new key pieces, down to say a 1, which would be a team that, like the Chiefs, that are just going to run it back with the entire thing intact, So maybe we start at the top, the most dramatic changes, right? And I give 2 teams, and you may disagree with the nuances here, but I'll explain why. I think there are 2 teams that are tied at the top for the most change and uncertainty, and that is Detroit and Jacksonville. And I say that because both teams have new general managers, head coaches, offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators, and special teams coordinators, and they are both going to have new quarterbacks under center. And I think those 6 pieces, when all 6 are changing, that's about as much change as an NFL franchise can undergo. Too. That's what I said, general managers as well. Yeah. So, so in Detroit, right, I think you guys nailed it when you talked about Dan Campbell. Dan Campbell strikes me as like a Mike Vrabel type. Yeah. And that if he's going to succeed, he's not an X's and O's guy. He's a leader of men. He's someone that they're hiring because they believe will set a tone in the locker room, build a sense of unity and camaraderie, hold people accountable. I love that he spent so much time alongside Sean Payton. I think Sean Payton obviously is one of the 3 or 4 best head coaches of his era in terms of, and I mean that as a head coach in terms of running an organization. And I say that understanding he spent time suspended for that whole thing, but I mean just his success has been unquestioned, I think, over the long term. So Campbell's going to be the figurehead, and we don't know what that's going to mean. Now it's interesting to me that he brought in Anthony Lynn as offensive coordinator, as a play caller. Certainly Anthony Lynn is experienced and by all accounts really well liked by his players. His players love him, so that's good. But whether you characterize his stint with the Chargers as a success or a failure, he wasn't the play caller during his tenure there as a head coach. And he only has 1 year of play calling experience, and that was with Buffalo, and it wasn't very successful. So again, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but he is being hired as a play caller. So it's more important. What he did as a play caller is much more relevant in a role of OC than it is when he was hired as a head coach. So I don't know what to make of Anthony Lynn in that role. I think we can posit, given the Campbell-Lynn combination, right, and where they come from, that if this goes well, it's going to be a very run-heavy, balanced offense.
Yeah, wrestling matches, boring. I mean, boring football games in the sense of being conservative. Like you're wanting to turn it into a street fight. You're not wanting to turn it into some tactical battle.
Correct. And if we're going to fantasy, then immediately you get excited about DeAndre Swift,
right? And
you presume that they're going to Brad Holmes, the new GM, is going to prioritize the offensive line, get that right. So Jared Goff,
right?
I wasn't a big fan of Goff to begin with when he was the Rams quarterback, even though he had some decent year-end statistical numbers. So I view him as pretty much like late round QB2 in a 12-team league at this point. It'll depend on what the roster looks like, but not very excited about that. Not very excited about the passing prospects. You got to think TJ Hawkinson could be a beast, because they may lose Galladay. We'll have to see. They're probably going to lose Jones to contract issues. Again, Campbell was a position coach for most of his career as a tight end. He also was an NFL tight end. So you kind of like that. And I know a lot of people make that conclusion and vault Hawkinson's ADP up, but I think that's justified. Hawkinson was a top 5 fantasy tight end this year. And so you get excited about that. And I love to see Aaron Glenn get the job again. Young black coordinator, was excellent as a player. I'm excited to see what he can do with that defense, which I think does have some pieces. But just a tremendous amount of uncertainty, right? Because they're all in new roles except for Anthony Lynn. And while he has been a coordinator before, it's very limited as a play caller. So a lot of uncertainty there.
Yeah, you can get a real good feel for what Dan Campbell is all about and what this organization is going to be about. I called this one, Woodrow, I think I called it like, it's like a culture enema, you know?
Yeah, right.
Like just flush out all the stuff from Patricia, because Patricia wasn't genuine.
Mm-hmm.
Patricia never won the players over because he wasn't genuine.
Correct.
And Dan Campbell's genuine as genuine's going to get, right? You bring up Vrabel, like what's the classic Vrabel line? Like we'll cut his own genitalia off for the Super Bowl, you know. But that stands for the idea of what kind of dude this dude is,
for sure.
And he hired a lot of former players. Deuce Staley, man, Deuce Staley.
Yeah,
I mean,
you know, and mm-hmm.
it just showed. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say for people that don't know, as Eagles, Deuce was never titularly the offensive coordinator in Philly, but he was the assistant head coach, and he was the guy that ran the team when Peterson was out with COVID. So he's got a lot of experience, and he's never really been thought of as a head coach. This year he had an interview or two, but I think he's got a ton of experience, and again, a guy that from what I understand, the players would run
exactly.
Yeah.
There's a theme here, right? The players, coaches, and he talked about how he hired a lot of former players. There's like 7 former players on the coaching staff because he thought it was the hunger. Like he mentioned, like Aaron Glenn has to go get coffee and pick this guy up at the airport and stuff like that. So like you have to have hunger and a desire to learn, desire to get better. I think there's going to be potentially a blind spot for game day adjustments, for making one-off game plans and things like that. A pretty straightforward team of like how they win, and if you can thwart them, then you're going to beat them that day. I love that you brought up play caller, by the way. I feel like we didn't the word play caller in our vernacular, like when we started this, wasn't like just commonly tossed about. We're so much more aware of it now, which is good. You brought up Goff, and I want to just say, and again, I'll echo this. I like to repeat myself, that I think this is the ultimate win-win deal. And I understand exactly why Brad Holmes, why the Lions would take on Goff for a first-round pick. I think it's perfect for where they are in the arc of their franchise. Feel free to comment on that, and we don't have to belabor this and go off get off completely from our topic. But overall, say whatever you want about the trade. But Stafford on the Rams, because they have got coaching changes, but not anything we're going to talk about on this show.
Yeah.
Are you probably less enthusiastic than a typical take about Radon in the middle, or more enthusiastic?
On Stafford, I guess I lean towards excited, just because I do think McVay is a special play caller. As you said, I think he's proven to be adaptable. He's aggressive. He can every now and then, like in the Super Bowl, he can admit that he gets kind of starstruck, but that's because he's young. But I think he's one of the special ones. And I think that the fact that he was excited to get Stafford organizationally, I think that tells me that at least while Stafford is healthy, they should have a few pretty explosive years. I think the Lions unfortunately have this stigma of a franchise that's just listless and hasn't been successful for most of Stafford's career. So even when he's had good statistical years, I feel like the average NFL fan doesn't think much of him. So I'm pretty excited about it. I mean, fantasy, I think he'll be. We just put out our first ranks. I think I had him 11th. So I'm excited by it. Now, of course, the health is a question, but honestly, I think we probably overplay health in the sense that most players, especially when they're in their 30s, are banged up. And, so is he any more of a health risk than like a Ben Roethlisberger or something like that? No, he's not. So I'm pretty excited about it. I'm going to let my mind race and probably get a little aggressive on the projections. And I'm going to at least entertain the idea of them having a top 3 or 4 offense overall and putting up big points. Sure.
It's like,
are you in the same boat?
Yeah. It's like a weight has been lifted off of Stafford. We don't know exactly how heavy that weight was. We'll see. But he should look like a different player in a lot of aspects just because of the situation that he's in. Like you said, McVay. I mean, has McVay ever had a quarterback like Stafford to work with? I mean, I guess was he on the staff when RG3 was there? I don't know, but
no. Well, I mean, I think McVay got this gig in the first place because of what he did with Kirk Cousins, right? Someone that people perceived, and I think correctly, is not that special athletically. Not much better, an above average NFL quarterback by talent, but not elite. And he, as we know, he fielded just about top 10 offenses in each of his years in Washington. So
yeah. And so the point is, if he can do that with Goff and with Cousins, what can he do with a quarterback?
Yes, to your point, Stafford, I think we can say confidently that Matthew Stafford, presuming health, is the most talented quarterback McVay will call plays for in the NFL.
Yeah.
So far. Yeah.
Unknown upside. I love unknown upside.
Yeah, me too.
And, someone's got to challenge the Bucs next year, right? Okay. Since you mentioned Saleh, we'll get to Jacksonville, but
Sure.
Saleh, Lebanese, by the way, Lebanese.
Okay, cool. Okay.
And from Dearborn, Michigan, which is the largest Muslim community. It's part of Detroit. A lot of people wanted him to go to Detroit. Let's go to the Jets, because I think this also the common link here is, Jets, Lions. These are considered organizations where it's like rot. It's like a house. But the foundation is falling apart. There's termites. So they're hitting reset with Saleh. And I think we can, and you brought up that maybe it wasn't the best year for Saleh's defense, but he was obviously still coveted. And he's one that is surrounded himself with a lot of familiarity. What's your reaction? Do you think that he can start to steer this thing in the right direction?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I will say a couple things. One, the Jets are an 8 or a 7 for me out of 10. Okay. And the reason it's an 8 or a 7 is because I don't know what the plan is with Darnold yet. Right. So if they break through the draft season with Darnold as the starter or likely starter, then I'd give it a 7. And that's because Joe Douglas is still there as the GM, so it wasn't a change there. I know most people listening to this don't care, but they kept their special teams coordinator in place, Brent Boyer, who's actually survived 3 coaches at the Jets now, so he must be quite a coach. Yeah. But there's still a lot of changes afoot, as you said. So I think what we do know is that Saleh was probably at the top of the list of most coveted of these hires, right? Mm-hmm. Someone that's been mentioned for a few years as he's going to be an NFL coach someday soon. Mm-hmm. And that's a very soft thing based on what we hear from beat. So it's hard to quantify why that's the case, but by all accounts, very organized, extremely good communicator, very disciplined. So I think those things are all things you'd want to have in your head coach. I think the question he'll have, and some of these other coaches we get to will have, is, did he have enough breadth of experience to bring in the right set of assistants? And what I mean by that is that he understandably does what a lot of young hires do, especially with their first go-around, is he just brought a lot of people from his old team because he knows them. But that doesn't mean they were the greatest hires, right? It makes sense that he brought Mike LaFleur as his offensive coordinator and the guy who's going to call the plays because he knew Mike from their time in San Francisco. It makes sense that he brought Jeff Ulbrich to coordinate defense because Jeff coached under him in San Francisco. Right. Those guys may be excellent hires, but they might not be. We just don't know. We don't. He didn't go from outside of his organization very much at all to fill his staff, and I think that's a bit of a risk factor, honestly. Yeah. I think Jets fans should be excited only because, well, for 2 reasons. One, you're getting rid of Adam Gase, which whatever you thought of Adam Gase, whatever you thought of Gase going into the hire,
one of the most bizarre coaching stints in NFL history, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
In our lifetime.
Totally.
Was there any coach that comes to mind that was more bizarre?
Right. Just angry, listless, disinterested. Woefully unprepared, I would argue, in the last 2 years in terms of the way he
kind of bold and boastful about it.
Right. Exactly. So you have to be excited about that, right? I hope that a lot of the time that through that process of hiring that Saleh really felt a kinship with Joe Douglas and their viewpoints, because obviously that's going to be key in what they do to rebuild this franchise, which has a lot of work to do. So I think it's the Jets fans. There's no reason not to be excited by the hire. I think if we're talking fantasy, it's such an enigma. They don't have a lot of talent in-house, frankly, right? There's very few elite pieces there right now. And that's putting aside what you think of Darnold. And again, LaFleur, you joked about nepotism. Well, he's Matt LaFleur's brother. He's part of the Kyle Shanahan coaching tree, who, Kyle is the son of a very accomplished NFL head coach. So there's all kinds of nepotism there. I know nothing about Mike LaFleur. What we do know is that he's coming from a team that he did not sniff play calling. He was not. Right. Kyle Shanahan is autocratic in that regard, just like Sean Payton is. And so he didn't call plays. He didn't come close to calling plays. He's a very young guy. I just don't know what. I guess the only thing we can assume is because they're all ex 49ers guys, they're going to bring that system to the Jets, right? They're going to bring that hybrid, power running version of the West Coast offense that Mike Shanahan arguably perfected, and that they've all kind of carried forward with some RPO thrown in over the years because of Kyle. So we know what the system's going to look like. We know what the playbook. We know what the plays are going to be called, how they're going to be structured. But it's just a question of is Mike LaFleur Bob Ross with the paintbrush, or is he my 10-year-old son? Right? We don't know. We don't know.
Yeah, and quarterback. I mean, a lot revolves around that. They could draft a quarterback. They could.
That's what I mean. If they
trade,
if they trade for Deshaun Watson, I would argue Robert Saleh is probably your odds-on favorite for the best coach of the cycle. Right. For nothing he does other than just keep Deshaun Watson happy. If they stick with Darnold, then I think you probably need to judge him in 4 or 5 years after he's cycled through Darnold and gotten another guy in house. And that's the trick. One thing I will say about, just quickly to touch on Detroit fans out there listening, it's been a rough go for you for a long time. I will say you should be encouraged by the fact that they got Brad Holmes, because he was the guy everybody wanted. And then secondly, you should be encouraged by the fact they gave Dan Campbell a 6-year deal. Now, I know they're built with billionaire owners. That doesn't mean they won't fire him in 2 years. But the fact they gave him 6 years tells me that they understand, hey, if we're going to really make this an organization we want it to be, we have to give them a long leash. We have to get through what they're inheriting, get a whole set of coaches and players and principles in place, and then see what we have. And that's encouraging.
Yeah, like Sean McDermott, like let the program. I'm sure Matt Rule's going to get that kind of latitude, and it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. So we'll see. Saleh, Campbell, you talked about being under Peyton. Saleh under Kyle Shanahan. These are successful guys. These are guys that seem to understand how to create a successful organization.
If I may, my hottest take for you today is that Kyle Shanahan is grossly overrated as an NFL head coach. He has his record with the 49ers is 29-35. Yes, he went to a Super Bowl, but he has 3 other seasons as a head coach where he's won 6 or fewer games.
Right.
So, what's the outlier? The Super Bowl year or the 3 6-win or worse years? So I have to tell you, actually, of the 2017 coaching class, Shanahan, 3 of them are fired already. Lynn Joseph and Doug Marrone are gone.
Yeah.
Of the 3 left, McVay, Shanahan, and Sean McDermott. McDermott was the one that everybody poo-pooed when they hired him. Mm-hmm. But I'd much rather have McVay or McDermott as my head coach than Kyle Shanahan. So I know it's probably a hot take for some, but I'm not sure.
No.
And if Shanahan doesn't win, and I mean 9+ wins playoff appearance this year, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he's let go.
Well, there's a whole thing here, Jason. We could go off on a tangent about teasing apart head coach quality from quarterback quality, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because arguably the year they went to the Super Bowl was the year that he got consistent quarterback play for a whole year.
Sure.
Sure. But at the same time, we saw that with Goff and McVay, and then the league kind of caught up to that, and you saw McVay actually probably rightfully make the offense a lot more conservative. That's what's exciting about Stafford, is that McVay can really let his imagination go. But yeah, and I think Shanahan, probably what he's more valued for is people watching what he does and learning from what he does and becoming better coaches, and also developing coaches. Or at least right now, it sure seems like the league, just like with McVay, really likes people coming up under him.
No question. Yeah, no question.
He said Saleh most coveted. If there's someone else that was as coveted as Saleh, it was Arthur Smith, son of the FedEx founder, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Atlanta gets their guy in Smith.
They do, and that's certainly one that's right under these others in terms of most change, right? Because you've got new GM and Terry Fontenot, another very sought after hire. Spent a lot of time in New Orleans under Mickey Loomis. Don't know much about him beyond reputation, but reputationally, he along with Peyton and Holmes were the guys that had kind of been in the ether as the likely next good GMs in the league. Art Smith's an amazing talk about. Again, we get back to the Vrabel idea, and how you just never know. Vrabel brings in Matt LaFleur as his offensive coordinator, this boy genius. Matt LaFleur spends 1 year in Tennessee where the offense is a wreck.
Yeah,
it's not effective at all. you wonder what. Well, that was a dumb hire. Why did you hire? He ends up then, of course, going to Green Bay, where he's been fantastic as a head coach, and also calls the plays, and the offense has gotten much better as a running team. So he deserves a lot of credit for what he's done in Green Bay. And what do? They don't. It's kind of similar to what they did this cycle. The Titans, they don't really hire anyone. They don't really interview any name offensive coordinator candidates. And then kind of at the end of the cycle, they announced they're just going to promote Art Smith to the role. And Titans fans throw their hands up and say, "What's going on here? Art Smith, who's this guy?" Like you're promoting a guy from a position coach from a system that just sucked last year. Well, 2 years later, Art Smith is the toast of the town and is taking over as the Falcons' savior. And his 2 years in Tennessee as a play caller were phenomenal. Nothing short of it. And what you don't know, Sig, and what we're going to really find out quickly is, I think right now, if you're optimistic about this hire of Smith to Atlanta, you're saying, "Oh, okay, well, kudos to Smith for taking a look at what he had in Tennessee and building a system around that, including the most run-heavy system." He had a guy like Derrick Henry and said, "We're just going to run and run and run," and it was really effective, right? And allowed Ryan Tannehill to become reborn as a fantastic option play-action quarterback, and everything just worked together. And so you say to yourself, like, Art Smith surveyed what he had, and he made the best dish he could. And if that's true, what we see from Art Smith's play calling in Atlanta will be much different than what we saw in Tennessee, right? Like, if that's true, if he's really just going to take what he has and make the most of it, we're not going to see a team that's going to run the ball for 2,200 yards. That at least not if they draft Najee Harris and all, maybe. But I'm saying going into this, we're going to assume that what the Falcons offense under Art Smith looks like is not going to be very similar to what we saw in Titans. If Smith is really special, right? Mm-hmm. Now maybe Smith just tries to bring Titans South or Titans Atlanta to the table, and then you're like, well, I don't know if the guys in place there are those guys, right? So we'll have to see. That I'm really intrigued by that, especially because he made Dave Ragone his offensive coordinator. Rag's supposed to be pretty good with quarterbacks, but he's not a threat to take over play calling or get it handed off to him. And then Dean Pease unretired for the 8th time to run the defense. And I presume that's just because he's a veteran leader and hopefully he'll get a couple young guys built up in a year or two to take over that defense. So I like conceptually what they're doing on paper, but Art Smith it's really intriguing to me because I think what we're going to, and we'll get a sense of whether Smith and Fontenot are on the same page at the draft, right? Yeah. Like, do they make Najee Harris their second round pick or trade up for, you know what I mean? Like, or someone like that. I'm using Najee as I'm speaking of Najee as though he's the consensus number one running back, but whoever they feel is that, like, do they bring in do they take Etienne in the second round and then a bruiser in the 4th round because they want to do what the Saints say? Those are the kind of things you're going to get a sense of, okay, are they on the same page philosophically? And I hope they do. I think they probably are in this kind of weird place with Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan probably is still good enough that you do continue to use him as your starter. But is that a 1-year deal? Is that a 2-year deal? That probably is the bigger question is how committed are they to Matt Ryan? And I suspect that Fontenot doesn't have the answer to that himself. I suspect they're going to go with Ryan this year. That doesn't mean they don't draft somebody else to replace him, but they're going to go with Ryan as a starter this year. And then he decides what he wants to do from there,
Right. It's part of that. Like you talked about Darnold and with the Jets. In some ways, just from a pure survival standpoint, it's better to play out a year or two with what you inherited at quarterback, because it starts the clock later in your head coaching tenure when you're really rated. But you're right. I mean, the long-term picture of this, whatever they say, isn't a Ryan Julio Jones team.
Right. And the good news is if you are a Falcons fan and you want some good news, I would say take a look at how the team played, both in terms of their energy, but also their results once the transition to interim coach was made.
Right.
Morris wasn't obviously an offensive guy, but he basically what they did is they became a much more balanced team committed to the run. And I think that I'm not saying the Falcons were a world beater after he took over, but they were a much better team. They were legitimately competitive. And so I think that there is a blueprint there. And I think that the Falcons on paper have the makings of an excellent elite offensive line. They've put a lot of draft capital into that over the last few years, and then they had some injuries, but those guys should be all back healthy. And so I think they have the makings of a pretty potent, balanced offense, presuming they get the running back situation figured out, because it's obviously not the guys in the locker room in 2020 are not going to be the guys turning that into a version of the Titans offense.
Yeah, and you brought up also that we're going to learn about Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith, and we're not going to necessarily be able to discern, like, are they in concert or it's reflecting one of them or the other, but at least we start to see what's really fun about head coaching changes or GM changes, especially when it cascades down to the whole staff, is you start to get the first picture, free agency really, and then the draft of what exactly are they planning. And sometimes we're wrong, but it's fun, the reveal, because those moves take on even more meaning whenever it's from a new regime.
Totally.
And so we'll see about Smith. Like you said, it's kind of a leap of faith, but you have to be pleased with what he did in Tennessee. Ragone with Chicago, I don't think I want to emulate the success of Chicago.
Yeah.
But there's familiarity there. Right. You bring up familiarity, like that's Tennessee, right? Like they love familiarity. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about familiarity when we get to the Eagles hire.
Yeah.
But we're saving the two worst for last.
Oh, come on!
So,
it hurt me.
Well, no. Well, I mean, I guess it's because in like Houston and Philadelphia are in like the soap opera NFL reality show.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like they're in like the stuff, like we're past Dynasty and we're into like As the World Turns. You know what I mean?
Definitely. Yeah.
In terms of the very public dramas that are out unfolding.
Well, I mean, to your point, you have Doug Peterson, who was the consensus worst hire of that 2017 coaching class, right? Then obviously goes on to win Coach of the Year and a Super Bowl, bringing Philly its long sought Super Bowl after all those decades of hardship, and then is fired. So it's absolutely a soap opera for sure.
Okay, but you mentioned Jacksonville top the show as a team with Urban Meyer. And of course, depending on how old you are, when you hear Urban Meyer gets hired, you think of Nick Saban or the old ball coach Spurrier or whatever.
Spurrier, yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a whole range of takes and history of elite college coaches making the leap to the NFL. There's obviously differences. The differences are different differences than they were when we're talking about the leaps those other guys made. So I don't know. There's a whole could go off on that, but we can say this, Woodrow, because I call Jacksonville the Weekend at Bernie's organization. Well, it's like in Shad Khan's portfolio, it's like his stepchild.
Yeah, we've talked about that, right? They have and his son Tony too, who's the executive vice president. I mean, Tony is the full-time showrunner for AEW Wrestling.
Sure.
And they own obviously an elite soccer team and
right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But this move says, okay, I'm going to give some attention to the stepchild,
Mm-hmm.
like you're on center stage. This is a big, big, big move. And it kind of makes sense from a Florida, like a regional standpoint. I brought this up when Cecil and I were talking about it, that if you go back to when Jacksonville and Carolina were the expansion franchises, a lot of the talk was like, wow, college football is so popular in that part of the country.
SEC country. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Urban Meyer had a lot of success just down the road in Gainesville. But what's your reaction to Urban Meyer, the staff he's putting together, and how much of it is just Urban Meyer looking at Trevor Lawrence and saying, yep, if I can coach with that guy as my quarterback, speaking about quarterbacks and Kyle Shanahan, I get to be with that guy as my quarterback? Okay, I'll give this a shot.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that we haven't had in our probably time together as football guys a more stone cold lock first overall pick than Trevor Lawrence, right? Because like even if you remember when Cliff Kingsbury took over in Arizona, people were like, oh wait, does that mean that? Right. And it ended up being the case, but that was still like odd. But in this case, right, it's clear that Urban Meyer believes Trevor Lawrence is a once in a generation, pick your comp, but your Peyton Manning, Andrew Luck level, no way he can miss unless he gets hurt guy. And I think that's probably you're much more of a draftnik than I am, but I presume that's probably the consensus view by most draftniks is that Lawrence is as close to can't miss as it gets for a pro quarterback. So we know what this is going to be. We know what this is about. Now I have to tell you, I think this is the splashy hire, right? This is the hire that gets fans hyped.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would classify it as the one I'm most confident in succeeding. In fact, it's probably toward the bottom of the list because Urban Meyer, for all of his success in college, and he's an all-time great, I mean, multiple national championships and turned several programs back into elite status. Listen, he's got wanderlust, right? He's repeatedly been at the peak, presumably at the peak of his career, and then either left because he was unhappy or in several cases because of stress and the health toll it was taking on him. So at this age, going to the NFL where he's never coached before, you wonder about that. I mean, he gave up Ohio State because of stress. So I can't imagine it's going to be a less stressful situation for him. Maybe it will be. I don't know. Maybe because he doesn't have to recruit and it's a little more stable in terms of what personnel is. Maybe it is going to be less stressful. But I do wonder about that. I think he was the name hire, but I still have visions of the Eagles and then the 49ers hiring Chip Kelly and obviously Nick Saban. He's the best college football coach of all time, but he was relatively uninspiring in his short stint in Miami. So I don't think we should be at all surprised if 2 years from now they have another new head coach. I also don't think we should be surprised if Trevor Lawrence is what we think he is, that they spend 5 to 8 years together and have a lot of success, right? So, and I know that seems like I'm kind of splitting the bit, but it really probably does come down to whether Lawrence is legit and whether they do a good job building around him. And that's where the hire of Trent Baalke as GM comes into question.
Yeah.
Baalke has a mixed track record. He's perceived to be a very good personnel man, like a very good personnel evaluator, but he's got other issues that we don't have to get into. So it's weird. And then what's really strange is I think Urban Meyer, because of his success, for those that don't remember, because we're old heads, Urban Meyer really kind of became a national thing because of his time at Utah. And he was bringing now what we all consider very basic college offensive coaching concepts. He was one of the first to really use spread and pre-snap motion and everything. And it was revolutionary at the time. And obviously a lot of coaches have taken it and run with it beyond that since. But he was one of the progenitors of that. And that's why Alex Smith was the first overall pick coming out of Utah, which is an odd thing. And so he was once perceived to be an offensive innovator. I think that label has long gone by the wayside, right? I think, he really didn't have much in the way of that in his stint at Ohio State. I think that was more about his recruiting prowess and all of that. And Ryan Day, who took over for him, arguably had better offenses than Urban had. But Urban's not going to call plays. Our good friend Darrell Bevel is going to call plays.
Yeah. With Brian Schottenheimer also on the staff, which is just delicious.
Yeah, which is great, right? Now, and I know lots of people like to poke fun of Darrell Bevel, but I have a fun fact for you. Mm-hmm. There are on paper 11 new offensive play callers. Well, 12 if you count Studesville and Godsey as separate.
Whatever that's.
But 11 teams will start week 1 of the 2021 season with new offensive play callers. The second most experienced play caller of those 11 is the aforementioned Art Smith, because he called plays for 2 seasons. Joe Lombardi is tied because it's actually not tied, but he called plays for 1.5 seasons. So he's the third most experienced. Anthony Lynn and Todd Downing are each have 1 season of calling plays, and then there are 6 teams that are going with first time play callers. Well, Darrell Bevel is the pivot. Darrell Bevel has called plays 10 for 10 years in the NFL for 3 different teams. So he's far and away the most proven commodity. Like we don't know what the offense is going to look like for those other 10 teams. We know what the Darrell Bevel offense is going to look like, right? And I know he doesn't have the most glowing reputation, but he's the safe pick here. He's the safe hire. Bevel's offenses are almost never terrible, but they're also very, very predictable and can be had by they can be outcoached by elite defenses, right? And that's why we see them kind of flounder in the playoffs. But I think he's had 6 top 10 offensive units in his time as a play caller in the NFL, including a stint with Seattle over 4 years where he had top 5 or 6 offenses every year. So statistically, he's probably going to put together a very balanced, effective offense. The Jaguars are not going to be a bottom feeder offense, but the question will be is can he take them in 2-3 years if when Trevor Lawrence has hopefully got a whole cast of characters around him to championship caliber? That we have to see, right? And that may be when we see a change made. But you could do a lot worse. Again, I know you're not a huge fan of him, but you could do a lot worse than bring in Darrell Bevel for your first offensive coordinator on a complete rebuild, because I do think that takes the disaster away. Like some of these teams that we're talking about, maybe we won't even get to, are going to have disastrous results, right? They're going to have 1 and dones, 2 and dones. They're going to have bottom of the barrel outputs and have to completely reshape things again in a year or 2 when we're doing this podcast. Darrell Bevel guarantees, along with Trevor Lawrence, that this will not be a dumpster fire in 2021.
Yeah, Lawrence is what makes it exciting. I mean, certainly.
What we worry about, let's be honest, you worry is does Bevel keep Lawrence from being Herbert level exciting? But then again, Anthony Lynn.
So
I mean,
Wild horses got to run, man. I mean,
I love that. Yeah.
yeah, you know, I mean, no, and Lawrence is that good, and he's got some talent, and Bevel's, like you said, I mean, you just come in and get to work like a professional who has a lot of experience. So it's exciting to think about what that's going to tail. I just like to think of Bevel and Schottenheimer, you know, having that X in common and both getting over the sting of that, how that relationship ended.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
Maybe they blossom together with Trevor Lawrence,
They
and
probably both have "Let Russ Cook" tattooed on their arm together.
right. And
Like
now
Rose.
Russell Wilson's calling out the offensive line. It's
Yeah.
interesting. It's interesting. The public, you know, you think of like those old nature films of like the mating dances and the ways that animals communicate with these gestures, and that's like Russell Wilson in the media with Pete Carroll, I think.
Listen, I mean, Russ is old now, right? Like, meaning that he's I think he's probably seeing his life flash before him. He's seeing the Staffords and the Matt Ryans. He's seeing Drew Brees retire, at least presumably retire. He hasn't done it officially, with one ring. He's seeing Aaron Rodgers approaching 40 years old with one ring, right? And he's thinking, like, that looks a lot like my career, right? Like, I'm a Pro Bowl, I'm an all pro. We were pretty good to very good every year, but man, are we really ever a contender of late? And you know, I would argue part of that is that they have to pay someone like Russ what they pay him. That, you know, that's why these guys it's hard to win Super Bowls when you're old and elite, because they're paying you $40 million a year. But that's talk for another day. Yeah.
So listen, I don't want to go over an hour here.
Mm-hmm.
Can we do a part 2 soon?
And sure. Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm. Let's save the other 3 teams for part 2.
Okay.
Because keep this in a nice digestible chunk. And plus, this was the last 10 minutes to just touch on some subjects. Okay?
Yeah, sure.
Touch on some things.
Mm-hmm.
First, while we're going kind of off the rails, because this is basically a couch episode.
Yeah.
We have something to dig into.
Mm-hmm.
First, say, you know, just have to recognize that it's been a really hard week plus in the football world, in the football media world, and the people who like obsess about football world. Chris Wessling, a lot of us knew Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Chris came up in the Football Guys message boards.
He sure did.
Fear and Loathing.
Like us, like you and I.
Yeah. Before there was this internet and this magical garden of all this football stuff, Football Guys message board was one of the
We were all
first
chopping
places.
it up back in the day, 15, 20 years ago, chopping it up in there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the pauses. And then Trez Paler, who, you know, I mean, Vaughn McClure last year. I mean, just look at how people react. The people, maybe you didn't know them, maybe you didn't personally interact with them, but certainly their work and their being part of this ecosystem that our minds are part of. But you just see the way people react. You see the way people react to his loss, the loss of him.
Yeah, and by the way, Pedro Gomez as well. I mean, he's not
Pedro Gomez from the baseball world. But again, all these the unexpected.
But I'm a huge baseball nerd too. I mean, we don't make our livings talking fantasy baseball, but I'm as nutty about baseball as a sport as football. So yeah, I mean, that was, you know, he's relatively my age cohort, a little older, but you know, has kids my age, so that, you know, those kinds of things hit hard.
Yeah, and Lance Zierlein did something really good. And he's just like, hey, instead of waiting for people to be gone to say how much you love them or appreciate them, we can tell each other all the time. And we try to do that on the show. That's Football Guys, you know, Joe Bryant, and it's good. Let's react to the Super Bowl. Tell me, just, you know, what do you react? What are you going to take away from this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a fan of just watching good football, it wasn't a great game, right? It was shockingly not a good game. I think in retrospect, hindsight's 2020, we all, at least I say we all, meaning I was part of this. A lot of us, I'll say, not we all, a lot of us totally misinterpreted and underplayed the offensive line issues with KC after Fisher tore his Achilles. And shame on us, because it's not like we don't know how important that is. But man, oh man, I guess I just didn't, because it was the Chiefs and because they were going back to the Super Bowl. I just thought they'd work through it, and they clearly didn't. So I think if we all had a do-over, we'd realize that we were really not giving the Buccaneers defense its credit in terms of that opportunity. That was just a case of you talk about matching up. I mean, the Bucs, in retrospect, we can say they just matched up really well with the Chiefs with a bad offensive line. So it wasn't a great game to watch, honestly. I mean, I know for people like us, we watch every snap and it's great, but I mean, just in terms of like my family and people, you know, my kids, they weren't that into it, understandably. I don't think this does a thing to change the trajectory of how we think about Andy Reid or Pat Mahomes. You know, Mahomes would have been, had he won this, he would have been the youngest quarterback in history to win 2. He won't be that now, but I still think there's no reason to think that he won't have more opportunities. We don't know he's going to win another one because of Rodgers and Breeze and all that, but I think he'll have more opportunities. He's that good. And I loved his response to it after, which was that that this is going to leave a mark for him, that this is going to define his career, that it really bothered him how he played and how the team played. So I think that's good. And what more can you say about Brady? I've always been, even though I'm an analytics guy and a data guy, I've always cringed at what I feel almost like. I almost feel like to be a fantasy analyst, you've had to sort of take the stance that Brady's overrated, and I just hated it. We used to have a guy on staff that wore it as a badge of honor, comparing him to other quarterbacks and how overrated he was, and I would get in arguments with him about how silly it was. And I love the trolling aspect of this, that sure. Now that he's done it again, 7, including on a new team as the MVP, it's just these arguments just fall flat now, right? They just fall flat to say that he's not okay. You don't want to say he's the GOAT, whatever, that's top, but there's just you can't argue Tom Brady's greatness anymore, which I love. I love that. I love to see that. I love that Arians as an older man came back and got a chance, and he was retired and had some health issues. That's awesome. Like you said, I love the aspect that we have lots of coordinators and senior level coaches on that team as players as coaches of color, who I think are now going to get their shine. I think Leftwich will be a relatively hot head coaching candidate in the next year or two, assuming that the offense comes back and is pretty good next year. So a lot of things, but not one I think I'm going to remember. I'm going to remember it for the significance to Brady's legacy. I'm not going to probably remember the game much, the play in the game much, I think.
Sure.
How about you?
That's true. There wasn't that signature moment, that picture, that mental picture that you put in your pocket and you can always carry with you. But it does stand for this idea that Brady is just absurd. I mean, he's just absurd.
And isn't it interesting what a difference a year makes, in the sense that I'm not going to sit here and say that Bill Belichick isn't the greatest coach of all time, but 51 and 65 without Brady, it just does speak to how important having a great quarterback is in the NFL and your legacy, right? Because you could say, oh, well, sure, 51, but 51 and 65 is 8 NFL seasons worth of coaching.
Yeah.
Most NFL coaches don't coach in the NFL as head coaches for 8 years in their life. And we have 8 years of Belichick without Brady that say he's a losing coach. And again, I don't want this to be interpreted as like Wood says Belichick. I think he's an incredible, still the best head coach of all time. But it's nice to know that we now can remove any nonsense of saying that Brady was a product of that system. Which is great.
Yeah. And I mean, just that he's even doing this
he's our age. You and I are old and busted.
Yeah.
He's our age. Yeah. I mean, we are shadows of our former self physically, just because of nature, right?
Yeah. I know.
He looks. They did that cool thing in the Super Bowl where they showed his picture each year of when he won the Super Bowl. He's better shape, better looking, more stronger than he is than he was in all those.
Exactly. There's a treatment of that on Twitter where a plastic surgeon shows you step by step all the different plastic surgery he's had. Anyway, because he is better looking. I mean, who wouldn't if you had the access to, if you could make your face. And that's the thing of our time, right? One of the things that's happening in our time is that you can actually turn yourself into the picture of what you are or want to be in your mind's eye.
Yeah.
But Brady is absurd. And believe me, I feel like Brady's not from my tribe. I just naturally, something in me, in my fiber, wants to root against Brady. Now granted, growing up, I wanted to root against Marino, I wanted to root against Elway, I wanted to root against Montana, any of the quarterbacks, Peyton Manning, that made winning feel inevitable. Something in me wants it to wants it to be inevitable. Wants it to be
right.
And Brady winning, but I have to take hats off to him. Although this really is all just the precursor, the prelude to the TB12 magnet, it's going to be some sort of worldwide magnet of healthcare, because it's all the origin story of you want to know how I did it? Check out the TB12 brand. I got to tell you,
I understand your perspective, but I think the last year or two have done wonders for Brady in that regard too, right? Where we're starting to see him for a human being instead of this automaton. And I know a lot of people are having fun this week with the whole throwing of the trophy and the stumbling drunk at. But you know what, man? Have most of us have had moments like that of pure joy and elation where we get drunk with our friends over something.
Oh, that was great. That absolutely humanized him. Absolutely.
Now, listen, I'm not gonna. Let me be clear. I wish they were masked up. I'm not gonna that. That made me uncomfortable, especially given the environment we're still in. But but taking that part of it away, which I'm not downplaying, because as you know, like mask up people, but just seeing him be human and vulnerable and not Teflon, where you just never see a hair out of place or he never has a pull quote. I love it. Like, that's one of the reasons I always disliked Derek Jeter as a New York area guy. Like, he's an all timer, but like, he was always on message. I never got a sense of who Derek Jeter was as a human being. So I like that we're seeing a little glimpse of what Tom's like as human.
And it's crazy. I mean, like, Tom Brady didn't just climb Mount Everest. He showed us, there's actually a mountain that keeps going past Mount Everest. Right. I'm gonna climb that too while I'm here.
I mean, I know we like to over hyperbolize moments, but do you envision a scenario where anyone ever catches him?
I mean,
because I don't.
Probably not. And what's interesting about this, I'm going to go a little bit over. Sorry, Cecil. I'll try to get it under an hour for the editing. But I want to give this treatment while we're on this subject. There's something about Brady, and I don't know exactly how to describe it. And it gets back to intangibles and these things, but something about his vibration or his wavelength or the way he carries himself or the way he goes about it. It's, if I had to root it in something, Woodrow, at some point early in his life, Brady felt like slighted. He felt like he wasn't being taken seriously. And it was like a blood oath or something that he was just going to prove to everybody to not dismiss him, to not just brush him off. And then the NFL did. I mean, he almost got cut for Rohan Davey, right? I mean, in his origin story, he was right on that. He was close to getting washed ashore.
Yeah, butterfly effect, right? That or what if Bledsoe doesn't get hurt, right? Like, there's
right.
Mm-hmm.
But he has something in him that just kind of broadcasts to the people around him that I mean, I hate to say it, I really do. I mean these words. I'm not just using it as a cliche. That really does look like the Patriot way was Brady more than Belichick, in the sense of like what it was that made people be able to come into the organization, play their best football. What it was. I mean, I'm not want to take away from Belichick's coaching, but you can just see, especially in the playoffs, it's like an invincibility cloak that the players feel like we're on, and it's something that developed over time. So it wasn't born; it kind of grew and snowballed, and it's quite a thing to watch because Tampa Bay, and it was for the one time, Woodrow, that the betting markets and the odds of the Super Bowl, I remember it shooting up, and it was right. I mean, it was really set in motion, and he actually like brought in the big fish. So I absolutely want to take my hats off to him, especially because I got like a pitchfork and torch Patriots mob after me when I said that Brady. Because it's what's astounding about it is he doesn't have some thing like some incredible talent or physical ability or even like a mental ability that is just so difficult to outmaneuver him. There's nothing about him that makes him exceptional in his play. It's just the convergence of everything. It's inexplicable how he can be the greatest quarterback. But before him, I guess, was Joe Montana, who also really had nothing that remarkable about him. It was just a sense that he gave his team that like, we're going to win today.
Well, I would posit that it kind of gets back to our opening talk about how difficult it is to handicap coaching. Similarly, there are aspects of even a player that's had 20 years of data behind it that we just can't quite codify, which is ability to handle stress. And I don't mean just in the moment. I mean in the huddle, in the locker room, with the coach, with the power players in the organization. And I think no matter what walk of life you're in professionally out there, there are different types of people who can handle different types of stress. And I think people like Montana and Bradshaw and Brady, we could probably safely say that they're just incredibly good at staying focused and on task in any stressful environment. And that is difficult. There aren't many people in the world that are like that.
And then in turn, like human beings, it's like a pheromone or something, Woodrow, that like we just pick up on. Like when your leader transmits that feeling, that you can have it come over you. It's there's all kinds of stuff about how our mental wavelengths interact that we don't totally understand yet, but you can observe all the effects of it. And football teams are really good laboratories for that.
I didn't believe in that for much of my life. And honestly, the thing that got me to view that differently was once my kids started playing higher level organized sports, once they got a little older. And that's when I began to rethink it, because I wasn't an athlete. I wasn't much of an athlete growing up. I was like a track kid. I didn't play organized team sports much. So it was all kind of more academic for me in terms of my fandom. And then seeing my sons and their coaches and the players around them that were elite players, I began to understand what you're getting at. Like there are moments and people that just just help raise everybody else, help them focus, help them get that burst of endorphins in key moments. And I was pretty much always that's BS. That's that's the stuff of a storyteller, until I saw my kids in those environments. I mean, it wasn't my kids that were those people. I'm saying, like, but seeing their play or their friends play elevated by those people. And I'm like, okay, no, this is real, because if this is happening at the high school level, then of course it's happening in college and the pros, even on a grander scale. So
yeah, and in workplaces and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Like in our lives.
Mhm.
What were your events in track and field?
I was cross country in the mile.
Oh.
I was terrible. I did it to stay in shape and to
That's
pad
good.
my college resume, man. Like, yeah.
No, that's, hey,
you know me. I was an academic. It was like, what do I have to do to get into the colleges I want to get into? It wasn't any kind of like, I want to win. I want to win this race, or I want to. That was not.
I wasn't in any organized or competitive sports. I was the announcer, and I kind of helped manage our basketball team.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a tennis team, in so much that it was me and my friend Will Shinsky. What's up, Will? That we would go to the park and play tennis, and because there was no tennis court or tennis culture where I grew up, when the WPIAL, Western Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic League, when lots of great football players come out of the WPIAL, a lot of great players come out of the WPIAL. Anyway, we went to the the sectionals as just like got our butts kicked, but we were the tennis team. But I think I stopped playing organized sports around like 7th or 8th grade.
Yeah.
But I still love playing sports. But that wasn't competitiveness, like true competitiveness wasn't necessarily.
That's what I mean. Yeah, I mean, we're, and as you know, I think I was the announcer for my kids throughout their entire football lives.
Yeah.
I was the high school announcer. My oldest is a senior, but I was the high school announcer all 4 years of his life. So I had a taste of that. But anyway, like that's my point is I think there is something to these intangible ideas of like pheromones or just an ability to sort of psychically elevate those around you. It's real.
There's so much of us, even though it seems like we have the greatest knowledge. People at every arc in human history think they have the greatest knowledge in human history, I guess. But there's so much of ourselves. We've conquered the world and we understand how to bend the world to our dominion, but we ourselves are still a mystery.
For sure.
And that's the area to explore. And to our kids and to the next generation, they'll take the ball down the field farther than we did. We take the ball down the field every week, and then we'll come back, Woodrow. We'll do this real soon. We'll talk about the Chargers. We'll talk about you, and otherwise go off on a walkabout. Talk about endorphins and all these other good things. It's always great to spend time with everybody. And happy Mardi Gras. I don't know if I don't talk to you before Fat Tuesday out there, folks. If you're in New Orleans, come by Dumaine and Dupree. We got a house float. And New Orleans spirit it's never gonna die, man. I mean, New Orleans is truly about endurance and celebration, and Mardi Gras will go on, and then comes springtime and we do the cycle all over again. So thank you everybody for being part of what we do Football Guys. We're still going to be open for the off season. Woodrow's coaching change article, all kinds of other great stuff coming up. Got my What We Learned series coming out, and it never ends, which is part of why we like it, because we like spending time together so much, always.
With you know it,
because we're so classy, and you're even classier.
Can